Okay, amazing. If you want to draw your conversations to a close, we're going to kick off. If we haven't met before, my name's Emma. I'm part of the team here at KXC, and it's total joy to see you today. We always have to say those two lines just so that everyone closes up their conversations, but we're here. So today we're finishing up in our teaching series called Encounters with Grace. And over the past few weeks, we've been looking at different stories in the Gospels where Jesus reveals something of people's true identity to them. That they're chosen, that they're forgiven, that they're loved, freed, called, and empowered. And we've kind of really been asking the question, like, how do these truths that we're loved, that we're chosen, how do they go from just being beliefs to our lived experience? Like, more than just believing that we're loved, like, what might it look like if our lives actually experience the embrace of a loving Father? Like, more than just kind of believing that we've been forgiven, what might our lives look like if we kind of left that shame from the past in the past? And today we're kind of finishing up this series by looking at the truth that we are called. And the question that we're kind of really going to be diving into today is like, what might it look like if we didn't just know that we were called by God, but we fully stepped into that calling and allowed it to give shape to every single part of our lives? And my guess is that the idea that we're called probably generates some different reactions in the room, right? And I kind of think it's probably because there's a lot of ambiguity around what it actually means to be called by God. Often it gets kind of solely equated with work or with a job. But what happens if you lose your job? Like, what happens if you're out of work for a while? What does calling mean in those moments? And as we look through scriptures, and my guess is probably as we asked around the room today, like, we see moments when God absolutely calls us into specific things, whether that's a line of work or to live in a certain area or, how to use our time. But these things, they're temporary callings. Not unimportant, like incredibly important, but they're temporary. But there's a permanent calling that every single one of us in this room today is given. And it's the foundation of everything that every other calling that we're called into is built upon. It's that we're called to follow Jesus. And if you lose sight of this bigger macro calling, then we very quickly lose our way. And it's this macro calling that we see most commonly in the Gospels. Like, the call that people receive from Jesus is a call to himself. He calls people to follow him. But this phrase is so often used in the church, right? And it kind of almost just sounds a little bit like a cliche now. Like, following Jesus, it's the Sunday school answer, like, yep, we nod along, yep, tick, we know we should do that. But the reality is that it's a lot easier to leave this call as a nice cliche, because to fully step into this means to hand over control of every single area of your life. Like, it's far safer and easier for this call to remain in the abstract. Because to follow Jesus in the gritty reality of everyday life will cost us everything. And yet for those who kind of take up the invitation, who choose to deny themselves, to give up their autonomy, they discover something more precious than anything this world could offer. Like, you experience the truth that the God of the universe, like, despite kind of your failures, your faults, whatever's going on in you, he wants you. He has called you by name. And more than that, he calls you to work with him in seeing his kingdom break out in all areas of your life. And so kind of whether you're a student or an engineer, whether you're on maternity leave or you're unemployed, like, your primary call is as a follower of Jesus. So my question for us today is, like, what if we didn't just kind of glaze over at, like, the usual jargon of following Jesus? What if we took this out of the box of theory and asked God to show us personally, what would it look like for me today to follow you with everything? And that's only going to be a work of the Spirit, so can I just pray for us as we dive in? Lord, we thank you for your goodness. We thank you that you're here with us. And I ask, Lord, would you come and would you call each of us afresh today by name? Would we hear you speak to us, God? Would you open our hearts now? And Lord, would you take these words I'm about to say and use them for your glory? Amen. Amen. So the passage that we're going to be rooting ourselves in today, it's found in John chapter 21. And this is the moment when Peter is called by Jesus. And Jesus actually calls Peter multiple times. Like, we often think it was this one-hit wonder and like the rest was history, but that definitely wasn't the case with old Peter. And I don't know about you, but I find that kind of deeply reassuring when I look at my own journey. But the story is right at the end of John's gospel. It's the last story in the book. And it's found in John 21. So if you have a Bible, feel free to grab that. It will come up on the screen. But just to give a little bit of context as to kind of where we've got to, it's not gone well for Pete, is basically how I'd sum up this moment in his journey. Like, in kind of deeply theological terms, he's like royally messed up. And he was one of Jesus's closest friends. Like, he believed Jesus was the Messiah. He was convinced that he would go to the grave defending Jesus. But when Jesus was arrested, he denied him 3 times. You know, at the moment where Jesus needed Peter the most, Peter runs away to protect himself. You know, Peter wasn't who he thought he would be when it mattered most. And he's just left with that kind of shame of kind of failing at the most important moment. And then Peter hears this incredible news. Okay, Jesus has risen from the grave. And can you just imagine like the weird mix of feelings that must have just been going on there for Pete? Like, probably uncontrollable joy. Like, the guy he loved, like his best friend, has risen from the grave. Amazing. There's probably quite a lot of confusion because, that means that the guy I was hanging out with for the last 3 years actually was the Son of God. Big existential crisis probably happening, something to process. And then there's probably some terror as well. Because he's like, the last time I saw Jesus, I was denying him. Like, where do I stand with Jesus? And in this chapter, we read that Peter has gone back to his old life. He's fishing. And they've been fishing all night in a boat out on the lake, and they've caught absolutely nothing. But then they hear this man kind of shout from the shoreline, like, throw your net on the other side of the boat. And as they do this, they catch this incredible amount of fish, and suddenly Peter realizes, oh, like, the guy shouting on the shoreline is Jesus. And like, his stomach must have like turned in that moment. You know that feeling when you're going to have a really hard conversation and like, butterflies, start to breathe faster, muscles tense up. Like, what is Jesus going to say to me? And we read that Peter just instantly, classic Peter, he just dives straight into the shore, straight into the water and swims furiously to shore. And some of the kind of more gracious commentators in this moment, they just suggest Peter's so excited. He just cannot wait to be with Jesus. So he's just like swimming furiously. But then there's this other school of commentators who are more my kind of people, who are slightly more cynical about human nature. And they kind of point out that Peter's probably trying to save face in this moment. Like, he knows that Jesus is probably going to tell him off. So he's like, I don't want that to happen in front of all my mates. I just want to have a private chat quickly, get this over with. And so when he arrives, what does he find? He finds Jesus cooking him breakfast. And we're told this really strange detail in the text. We're told that Jesus has made a charcoal fire. It's a fire of burning coals. And the word to describe this specific fire in Greek is anthrokion. And it's a really obscure word. It's only used twice here in the whole of the New Testament. Once here, and the other time it's used to describe the fire that Peter stood round when he was denying Jesus. And a charcoal fire has a really distinct smell, right? Like, if you go to a barbecue, like, your hair is stinking for days, like, it's not a good smell. And we're told by psychologists that the most triggering sense for our memories is smell. And I don't know, I was just thinking this, I don't know if there are memories that you get when you smell something. It just like instantly transports you somewhere. For me, does anyone remember the body spray Impulse? Anyone? Yeah, there's some nods. Okay, that played a big role in my teenage years. And let's be honest, it's probably an era we don't want to revisit, right? But every time I smell body spray Impulse, I just feel like an awkward teenager again, like dousing myself before the school disco, like cringe feeling. But you know, smell doesn't just remind us of something. It makes us feel how we were feeling. And the last time Peter smelt that distinct smell of charcoal fire was when he was denying the man that now stood in front of him. Instantly transported back to that memory of shame and guilt. And Jesus turns to him and he says, come and have breakfast. Now, if I was Peter, I'd have been like, what have you put in the breakfast? Like, maybe that's just my cynical view of human nature, but I'd have been even more scared at this point. Is this some deeply passive, aggressive way that Jesus is going to get back at me? But then we read this from verse 15. This is what happens. When they'd finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt. "Lord, you know all things, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself, you went where you wanted. But when you're old, you'll stretch out your hands, someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said to this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." And doesn't this just kind of reveal to us the kind of God that we worship? Like, Jesus only has a few days before he's taken up to heaven, and he spends one of them taking the time to restore the faith of an ashamed follower. Like, he takes the time to recreate this scene of Peter's greatest failure in order that a failure wouldn't define him going forward. Like, he takes the time to show just one man the call he gave him all of those years ago. It's still on offer today. Like, despite your failure, how you've messed up, I still want you as my follower. Come follow me. And this invitation that was extended to Peter is the call that Jesus gives to every single one of us in this room today. Despite your past, despite how you've messed up, despite your weariness in this moment, your inability to think because of tiredness, or, the moments that you've doubted God's goodness, the call on your life hasn't changed. Follow me. In Matthew 13, Jesus gives this picture of what this call to follow him looks like. He says this. He says, "The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy, he went and sold everything he had and bought the field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found a pearl of great price, he went away, sold everything he had, and brought it." I wasn't getting emotional there. I was just hiccuping. Deeply holy. So to follow Jesus is both to give everything we have and to receive more than we could ever imagine. Like, was it a sacrifice to buy that field, that pearl of great price? Absolutely. Like, was it a sacrifice for Peter to follow Jesus? He's told he's going to not want to go where he's going to be going. Like, it's a huge sacrifice. But in joy, they give up everything because they've discovered something greater. And so today I just want to spend some time unpacking that paradox of following Jesus by looking at two things. Like, what is the cost of following Jesus? And what is that pearl of great value that we receive? So the cost of following Jesus. What does it actually look like to follow him? Well, Jesus spells it out really easily in Luke 9:23. He says this, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me." And what we see here is that the call of God demands a response. To follow Jesus is an active thing. To accept God's call to follow Jesus means to die to ourselves, to our own ways of doing things, to our own moral codes and desires, and to follow his way. Like Jesus' invitation, I think it's Bonhoeffer who said this, is if you really want to live, first come and die. Welcome to church this morning. And I've often thought, like when reading this, that Jesus really could have done with some sales advice. Like for me, when I'm asking someone to do something, if I'm emailing someone, I'm kind of like, "Hi there, hope you're well, ? Something nice about the weather, probably. Then, hey, I just wondered if there might be a chance you might be up for doing this. Absolutely, you know what, no worries if not. Like just wanted to throw it out there and might see if you kind of, if this was something you might be after." But with Jesus, there is no softly approach. Like he's so honest about what it will cost in this world to follow him. But what Jesus is saying here is before you jump into following me, you need to weigh up the cost. And he says it because when you do the maths, it's a no-brainer, right? Like it's the story of the hidden treasure of the pearl of great price. The return far outweighs the cost every single time. But it requires us to give over every single part of ourselves. It might mean death to our reputation when people say, like, "You actually believe this?" or a death to a career ambition when what it takes to climb the ladder is incompatible with following Jesus, or a death to a life of comfort when we go without so others can receive, or a death to our pride, like not chasing a life of significance or status, but serving in hidden and forgotten places. And it's hard, right? Because we find all sorts of ways to justify our lack of self-denial. I'm very good at it. If you want any tips, I can give you some. Like especially in our culture where self is king. But the hidden heresy under the surface is that we sometimes believe Jesus wouldn't ask me to deny myself. The Christian writer Skye Jethani, he nails it when he says this. He says, "My secret is I want to be relevant and popular. I want my desires fulfilled and pain minimized. I want to be transformed into the image of Christ by showing up at entertaining events rather than the hard work of discipline. I want to wear my faith on my sleeve and not look at the darkness in my heart. And above all else, I want a controllable God, a divine commodity to do my will on earth as it is in heaven." To say yes to following Jesus is to say yes to so many incredible things. And don't panic, we will get there. But it's also saying no to a lot of other things. Some of the things we say no to as well are actually really good things. They're not bad, but we're called to hold nothing back. Some of you might have heard of John Wimber. He was the founder of the Vineyard Movement, which is a group of churches. And he saw God work incredible ways through his life. And he was someone who experienced the cost of following Jesus, but he'd often talk about this pearl of great price with just such joy in his voice when he was describing his relationship with Jesus. John, he became a Christian when he was 29, and by this point in his life, he had a really successful musical career. He was a musician by trade. And in the early days of kind of starting to learn what it meant to follow God, he was attending this Bible study group. And one night, they're kind of just sitting round in someone's lounge, like they've had the cup of tea, and they kind of open the Bible and they start reading this parable of the pearl of great price. And these other people in the group, they'd been Christians for quite a while. They've heard the parables many times before. But John has never heard it. And so he suddenly just stands up in the middle of the room and he interrupts the group and he's like, whoa, wait a minute. Are you saying to me that a Christian might have to give up everything he has? And the other people in the group, they've all been Christian a while and they start to kind of shift uncomfortably in their seat and they're like, oh, we just, read the parables, don't think too deeply about them. Let's best not to ask any questions. And in that moment, John knew just instantly that God was calling him to give up his career as a musician. And that night he goes home and he gathers everything that was part of his musical career. His kind of albums, all of his instruments. He gets all of £1,000 worth of equipment. He puts them into cardboard boxes. He puts them in his car. He drives a few miles up the road to the tip. And he takes out all of these cardboard boxes and he just watches all of these instruments, all of these equipment just kind of soak away into the garbage dump. And when I read that, I was like, oh, John, that's a bit over the top. You could have at least given that to charity. Let's think this stuff through. That's slightly over dramatic. Calm down. But when I scratch below the surface of my reaction, I think it's because there's something deeply uncomfortable about watching someone throw it all away to follow Jesus. Because to be honest, I'm not sure I could do that. I've got quite a good setup here. I'm doing good things for God. My life isn't bad. Maybe sure when I was a teenager, I was more up for this stuff, but now I've got responsibilities. It wouldn't make sense. But the call isn't to maintain our seemingly good life for Jesus. The call is to follow him wherever he goes, wherever he asks. And please don't hear me wrong. I'm very much not suggesting that we all just kind of hand our resignation into our bosses tomorrow morning. That would be a wonderful media story. That is not what I'm saying. Although for some of you, that actually might be the case. And if that is you, please prayerfully discern that with some people you trust. But the point is, the question I'm asking is, what is the posture of your heart? Does Jesus really have full say over your life? Over your money? Over your career? Your kids? Your relationships? And maybe there's something that instantly comes up for you that you know is off limits to God. I know that does for me. It's hard. What would it look like to surrender that afresh today?
And this leads us to our last point, because the only reason John was able to do this stuff was because he discovered the pearl of great price. He discovered Jesus. What John Wimber discovered, what kind of Peter found out, what countless men and women throughout the ages have given their life for, is the joy of knowing Jesus. Like, following Jesus has enabled them to walk through the good, the bad, the ugly of life with an unshakable hope, because the story of his death and resurrection is their lived experience. Like, they've learned what it means to daily pick up their cross. And because of that, they've experienced the resurrection life that comes the other side. Like, Jesus paid the ultimate cost on the cross. And as he burst out of that grave and defeated death, he gives us all an invitation to come and follow him, to taste the life of the kingdom, to be transformed by grace. And I guess my question today is, like, do you know him like that? Not do you know about him, or you intellectually ascribe to that story, but do you personally know him like that? Is he the one your whole life is orientated around? And as I was kind of writing this, I just had this sense that for some of us in the room, like, we used to know him like that. But something happened, maybe just grew older and thought, that's quite naive. Or maybe we just experienced disappointment. Some things didn't turn out how we thought they would, and things hurt in life, right? We get hit and, things happen, but disappointment crystallizes into apathy. And we now just live with this kind of low-grade dissatisfaction with our faith. We've diluted the call down to something manageable and acceptable on the surface. And following Jesus has gone from something that our whole life was orientated around to just singing the songs, going to the right groups, going along to the right events, adding our amens. But the faith that was once on fire is now just theory. But the tragedy of it all is that we miss out on that pearl of great price. Because sure, theory can help you make sense of the world, but it won't set you free. Like, a theory is fine when everything is working, but it cannot comfort you in moments of pain. Like, a theory can explain what's happening in the present, but it will not be something you can build your life upon and give you a solid hope for the future. But Jesus can. Like, the one who conquered death itself, who has given us a hope that cannot be shaken. He isn't offering us theories and concepts that we intellectually ascend to. He wants all of you. Not because he's greedy, but because a surrendered life is the only way we allow him to redeem and heal and restore us, and in turn redeem and heal and restore a broken world. And if that's you today, like, if you know the flame has died in your faith, I think Jesus is standing at the shoreline of your life, calling to you, come and have breakfast with me. And we have a choice in this moment to either ignore the call, like to carry on fishing, or to jump into the water, to swim to shore. Like, Jesus wants to encounter you afresh today and take the weariness, the hurt, the confusion, the anger at him, whatever it is, to take it and to transform it into an encounter with grace. Just as I come into land, I came across a story this week of kind of the extraordinary intimacy that is found with Jesus when we give him everything. And it's a story of a man called Ming Dao, and he was a Chinese Christian kind of preacher. And in 1955, he was imprisoned by the communist government as being a threat to the state because he refused to endorse the state-run church. And he was thrown into jail, he was tortured, and he was told to renounce his faith. And he'd spent years counseling Christians how to kind of stand resolute in the face of persecution and how, to follow Jesus no matter the cost. But after several months, like, prison broke him, understandably. And he one day was sitting in a state interrogation room. The state interrogator came in and he hands in this ultimatum. And he says, you can stay in prison for life, or you can sign this confession and you can renounce your faith and you'll be a free man. And just fearful of what prison would do to him, Ming Dao, he signs the confession, he renounces his faith, and he's released from prison. But as he kind of walks out of those prison gates, and the next few days and weeks after, he's just flooded with grief as to what he's done. And it's this Peter story where he thought he wouldn't deny Jesus. He thought he was all in, but at that critical moment, he falters. But Ming Dao, in his moment of grief, just hears Jesus calling to him on the shoreline of his life. And he has this incredible encounter afresh with Jesus. And he experiences his grace. And he resolves in his heart to follow him again. And so what he does is he walks back into the police station. He asks the authorities to rip up the confession and rearrest him. And sure enough, he's quickly imprisoned. And he's sentenced to life in prison in solitary confinement. But the way that he talks about those years are utterly remarkable. Like, he calls his time in prison his honeymoon with Jesus. And he said that as he walked back into prison, the feeling of utter emptiness that came when he walked away from Jesus was replaced by a weird, strange sense of fullness and peace and new life. And he prayed and he asked Jesus, like, what does it mean to follow you in here? Like, I'm in solitary confinement. How on earth can I be used? And he was an evangelist at heart, and he wanted to reach people, but he couldn't because he was in solitary confinement. And then one day he has this moment of inspiration. Like, the cell that he was in was cut off from everyone else except for one thing, except for the toilet in the corner, because the sewage pipes running from the pit toilet in the corner of his cell were linked to others in the block. And so right there and then, he has this moment of inspiration, and he's like, I wonder if this will work. And he kneels down, and he just starts preaching into the pipes. You literally can't make this stuff up. So he starts preaching into the pipes, and the sound carries, and he realizes that people can hear him. And so each day, he kneels down, and he starts preaching, telling people about the pearl of great price that he's discovered. Complete and utter foolishness, right? Totally foolish. And for weeks, he receives no response, but then one day, a man replies. And then others begin to answer. And over the next 7 years, 96 prisoners come to faith. And this underground church is born in the midst of a prison. Like, his desire to follow Jesus, no matter the cost, brings about resurrection life in the midst of the darkest place on earth. And in total, he spends 23 years in prison. And when he was later released, he was asked how to describe his time. And he turns to the interviewer, and he just has this glint in his eye, and he smiles, and he says, it was my classroom of grace. Like, total foolishness. Like, to the world, surely that 23 years were wasted. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't, this great experience. It was hard. It cost him everything. And it made no logical sense. But to those who have discovered Jesus, who have discovered that pearl of great price, it's something worth giving everything for. Do you know Jesus like that? Like, what we see from the story of Peter is that Peter's legacy is not his competency at following Jesus. He's not that good at it. But what it shows us is that being a follower of Jesus isn't determined by how good we are. Being a follower of Jesus is determined by the measure of our ability to accept Jesus' grace. And what Peter teaches us is, in that moment of weakness, when we mess up, we're not disqualified. We don't have to cover up and hide. To follow him means to open ourselves up to grace. And that's why John Wimber could leave it all behind. Not because he's holier than any of us in the room, but because he experienced the grace of Jesus that changes everything. Like, what Peter shows us is that the great temptation of following Jesus is to think, I can do this. But the great invitation of following Jesus is that one day too, you might have a legacy of grace, just like he did. Like, that you might experience God as the one who is able to repurpose and rework your life again and again and again into something beautiful that he can use for his kingdom. The question is, will you let him? Will you accept the call? Like, receive his grace, pick up your cross daily, and follow him. Why don't we stand, and we're just going to spend some time asking God to meet us. And as I said, this is only a work of the Spirit. It's not something we can muster up and try really hard to do. So why don't we just spend some time just closing our eyes, and we're just going to invite God's presence to come. Holy Spirit, come. We just wait for you now. You know where each one of us is at, so come and speak to us, I pray. Words of encouragement and life. And let's just wait for a few moments now.